Okay, so cash balance plans have become more common, and the size of cash balance plans within retirement plans are becoming larger. So Faro has the capability to model complex cash flows and multiple cash flow sets within a single plan. Our goal today is to provide you an understanding of the data requirements needed from the actuary, how to model the liabilities, and how to analyze the data within the different sections in Faro. Michael, I think it makes sense to start with how to load the cash balance plans. How are they defined, and what information is needed to load a plan?
Yeah, I can certainly do that. Thank you, Amanda.
Mhm.
The participants in the cash balance plan accrue both pay credits and interest credits on an account balance. And the interest crediting rate is set by the plan sponsor, and they can be quite varied in nature. This can mean it's a fixed rate, it could be a variable rate, or it could even be a function of a variable rate, such as a 30-year Treasury yield with a floor of 4%. To model the cash balance features of the plan, we would need the cash flows to be split by participant type and plan design in normal form of payment, which means annuity form for traditional benefits and lump sum form for cash balance benefits. We would also need to know how the ICR for the plan is defined.
Thank you, Michael. That's helpful. The screen you're looking at here is our alpha liability header setup. The plan we are going to walk through today is a combination of a traditional plan and a cash balance plan. We chose to have a combination plan so we can fully showcase Faro's ability to model the total plan as well as the subcomponents. We have previously loaded the monthly assets and traditional plan cash flows for the accruals. Michael will now walk us through the necessary steps to model the cash balance plans.
Here you can see that I have my cash flows in Excel, and they're split by active and terminated vested participants in lump sum format as requested by the actuary. Using the convert 1D to 2D option within Faro, I will copy and paste the active participant cash flows. I will change the participant type if needed. Here, active is the default, so for this one I can leave it as is. And then I'll assign the pre-retirement indexation. I'm going to assign ICR here. And then lastly, I will convert the single dimensional cash flows to a diagonalized set of cash flows. I'm now going to repeat those steps to load the term vested cash flows. A little bit quicker now, but paste in the cash flows, change the participant type, and assign the ICR and diagonalize.
Before you move on, Michael, can you explain what that conversion from 1D to 2D means, and why are you diagonalizing cash flows?
Of course. As you can see, when I converted the cash flows, we went from a single column view to a grid view that shows payment year and commencement year. This is an important step for cash balance plans to model the liabilities appropriately. Cash balance cash flows are exposed to changes in the ICR prior to retirement only. The 1D to 2D transformation process is necessary to configure this exposure. You will want to diagonalize when working with lump sum cash flows, as the cash flows are paid as lump sums upon commencement.
Perfect. Let's move over to the economics tab, where we will assign our discount rate methodology as well as the ICR. Faro is quite flexible with the formulas to allow users to be as creative as necessary. Michael, what is the curve we will use for all participant types, and how is the ICR for this plan structured?
Yes, so for this plan, we're looking at an accounting basis. So we're going to use the daily BAML curve for all participant types. This is a AA yield curve. The ICR for this plan is the greater of the 10-year Treasury yield and the 1-year Treasury yield plus 1%. So we need to make a few modifications to the default settings. ICR1 is set up to be the 30-year Treasury yield. So the modifications required here are to update the tenor reference from 30 to 10 in both the methodology and the historic rates expressions. Similar to ICR1, the tenor reference for ICR2 will be adjusted from the 5-year to the 1-year Treasury yield. The final adjustment required to complete the ICR setup is to change the max formula to be plus 1% rather than plus 2% on ICR2. In order to further analyze the impact of shocks to the different tenors of the Treasury curve with regards to the ICR, we can utilize the flexible parameter capabilities when testing scenarios in both liability and combined what-if screens. If we scroll down, you will see the Manage Assumptions option. And here, we will add the parameter option for both ICR1 and ICR2. We can type in the parameter name. This is whatever we like, so calling this ICR shift, ICR1 shift, and ICR2 shift, and we set the default value to be 0 in both cases. Once these are set up, we can then incorporate them into the ICR1 and 2 methodology expression formulas above. Lastly, in the Risk tab, we configure the ICR for VAR purposes. We need to select tenor 10 from the drop-down list for ICR1 and tenor 1 for ICR2. No further adjustments are required for the ALM tab, as these settings automatically come from the risk settings.
Perfect. Let's move on to the Preview tab, where you can do a reasonability check on the information that was loaded in the system. Under Statistics, if you scroll down, click Statistics, you will see some information on the liabilities, the discount rate, duration, and convexity. If anything looks to be off here, I would recommend before you publish data that you would go back and make any adjustments needed to reflect what you're actually trying to look for here. Okay, and then I will go ahead and publish. And since publishing does take a little time, we already have the tabs preloaded at the top here. So in addition to the total plan, we have set up two subcomponents of the plan using the strategies framework. Clients may want to view the cash balance plan and traditional plans in isolation, which would allow users to manage asset allocation and risk variables separately. Now that everything's set up, we can start walking through the different analytics. So let's start with the dashboard. The dashboard is the main landing page in Faro that allows users to quickly view funded status, plan changes over time, VAR, and scenario analysis. The default view will show the total plan's aggregated data in all 4 quadrants. However, with the strategies framework, you can type the strategy you want here and the ability to change all 4 quadrants to whatever that strategy is. If your traditional plan is on a glide path, you can still set your funded status triggers on that strategy, which you can see in the top left quadrant here. It's very important for those plans to keep those triggers in place. That way, when a trigger is breached, you'll still be aware and you can make the necessary changes to funded status. I'm going to try to move this out of the way, Michael, because I think it's kind of blocking. It don't move. Okay, we'll just move it way over here.
Okay, next let's view the Combined tab, where users can look at curve exposures, scenarios, cash flow profiles, and what-if analysis. We'll start with the Curve Exposures tab, and here we're looking at the cash balance portion of the plan. Here you will notice the spike in the liabilities at the 0 to 2 year bucket. So here we're looking at the KRDs, and typically we're looking at a 1 basis point bump across the yield curve, which you would expect lowers the liabilities because you're increasing the discount curve. It's inverted at the 0 to 2 point because of our interest crediting rate. If you recall here, we set up our crediting rate to be the max of the 10-year and the 1-year Treasury plus 1%. And based on current yield levels, the 1-year Treasury yield plus 1% is essentially winning between those two and driving the crediting rate exposure. So in this case, for the cash balance plan, you typically see that inverted KRD at a specific point. We look at the table view of the KRDs, you can then see that the overall interest rate duration of this portion is very close to 0, while the credit portion is more in line with what you typically see in a traditional plan, around 10 years. And of course, the distinction between the interest rate and credit duration for the cash balance plan is due to, in this case, the ICR being treasury based. So it essentially offsets the discounting of the cash flows on the treasury side, but has no impact on the credit spread side. If we contrast that, we can now look at the traditional plan. And in of course, traditional plan, key rate matching and hedging are very important components. Here you can see that the interest rate and credit duration are both around the 10-year mark. And it's important, as Amanda said, for pension plans to maintain that target hedge ratio and a balance between credits and treasuries as the allocations for plans move down their glide paths. This is the first option screen where we've also show you the capabilities of the what ifs. So you're able to make adjustments to the asset allocation within this screen to look at the impact of comparing different portfolio strategies and what their effect would be on liability matching. Staying within the combined tab, let's also look at the movements. And here we're looking at the movement over the last month and how it's impacted for the two separate components. We start with the cash balance component. We can see that the funded status over the month of June is increased by just over 1%. While meanwhile, on the traditional side, we saw a smaller improvement of just over 0.6%. And the waterfall charts illustrate what that makeup is down to. And of course, in this case, our cash balance plans has done very well because it's a more aggressive portfolio, which performed well during June, while the traditional portfolio is a higher matching proportion and less in growth assets. But you're able to see that side-by-side comparison of the two components. If we move now onto the what if tab, we can now interrogate some of what the impact would be on different assumptions for the plan's liabilities. We're going to focus just on the cash balance component here. And I'm going to perform a few different shocks just to show the impact that different assumptions can have on the value of the liabilities. We'll start by shocking the interest rates. This is essentially shocking the discount rate of the plan. As we mentioned earlier, this is a AA-based yield curve. So we are essentially saying if the AA yield curve were to rise by 50 basis points, this would be the value of the liabilities. And you can see it's a reduction of around 4.8%. Let's now look at the impact of shocking the ICR by 50 basis points similarly. And we're going to do this by looking at each one in isolation. So first one we're going to do is we're going to shock the first ICR. So this is ICR 1. That's the 10-year Treasury yield. And you can see that by doing that, it makes no difference to the overall value of the liabilities. And this is, of course, driven by the fact that currently 10-year Treasury yields are just under 50 basis points lower than one-year Treasury yields. And because of that 1% margin added to the one-year Treasury rate, shocking the 10-year by 50 basis points doesn't make any difference. However, when we then shock the ICR2 shift, we're essentially shocking the one-year Treasury yield by 1% plus 1% by 50 basis points. We can see that that not only increases the liabilities by fractionally more than the reduction by shocking the yield curve that the plan's discounting liabilities with, but you can also see on the cash flow chart an increase in the cash flows being paid because, of course, as the interest crediting rate increases, the cash flows assumed to be paid in this portion of the plan will increase.
Perfect. Is there anything else we should walk through?
Yes, Amanda, let's move over to the risk tab and we can look at a few more things there. Here we can look at for risk attribution, market events, and what if analysis. So if we just look at the attribution first, you can see here we're looking at the cash balance component. And you can see that what's very striking here is that the size of the liability risk is very small on that right-hand side. And this is once again down to the fact that in this case, cash balance plan, we saw that zero interest rate duration coming through on the KRD analysis. And once again, in the stochastic VAR analysis, that zero the interest rate risk on the cash balance component is very low, essentially because that the Treasury component of the Treasury nature of the ICR essentially acts as a natural hedge to the Treasury component of the discounting curve. We contrast that with the traditional one, you can see here that the liabilities is a much more sizable piece of the overall risk, but now we've got the hedging portfolio that is mitigating that risk. And once again, there's the growth assets. So quite different dynamics when we're looking at the value at risk breakdown between the two plans. And as we've kind of talked through during the session, the value of being able to look at each portion of the plan separately is really helpful to understand these these characteristics in more detail.
Yep, and I think we can add a little bit more to this too if we just went to show the what if tab. You can adjust the asset allocations. Here I just selected the cash balance participants, but you could of course do this at the total plan level or at the traditional plan level as well. I did add another allocation down here where I just reduced some of the exposures to the risky assets and recalculated the portfolio to see what impact that would have on the expected return and risk of the portfolio. And by eliminating and reducing some of those exposures, I've adjusted my return slightly from 5.29 to 5.13%, but you can see I've had an 8.5% reduction on my total net risk as well. And you can see where I'm changing that risk by looking at the comparison bars. So I'm a little bit conscious of time. So we've had a few questions come in, and Michael, if you're okay, I would like to jump to those unless there's anything else you would like to add.
That sounds good to me, Amanda.
Okay, perfect. So the first question is, I have a plan where the benefit paid to participants is greater of the cash balance benefit and the frozen grandfathered annuity. How would you recommend modeling this plan from a cash flow perspective?
Well, that's a good question to start. It's a good question to start off with. Yes, it's certainly a challenging type of plan to model. I guess the nature of this design really means that aggregated cash flows cannot be fully accurate, given that it's a participant level comparison that is actually being paid at the plan within the plan. However, what you can do, and our approach we would recommend here, is essentially to request or from the actuary, or if you're the actuary for the plan, to model additional sets of cash flows where you essentially applying a sensitivity to each of the variable rates. So have a base set of cash flows, an additional set of cash flows where you shock the ICR by 100 basis points, 50 basis points. If there's a lump sum feature of the plan, probably is in this type of plan, shock that lump sum discount rate by a similar amount. And then those series of sensitivities can be then used in collaboration with the base set of cash flows to load a single set of cash flows into Faro that will both capture the sensitivity to the interest crediting rate and also the sensitivity to any lump sum feature that the plan may have. So it requires a bit more work up front, but the overall design can still be captured within Faro's modeling capabilities.
Awesome. Ready for question 2?
I'm ready.
So I have a cash balance plan that has an ICR of 30-year Treasury yield with a floor of 3%. How can I model this in Faro?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we can address that one if we go back into the setup screen that we were in earlier. So we talked through one example here where we essentially were doing the max of 2 variable rates. If you click in on the ICR option where we've essentially are doing a function of the 2 underlying yields, you can see there that there's a template option at the top, which has a few more suggestions. And you can see there that we have 2 simple floor cap ones. The one that Amanda's essentially is hovering over is essentially saying, I'm going to use the ICR one. So in this case, we've changed it to the 10-year, but that could be set to be the 30-year rate. And then the next parameter is the floor. So we're saying it's a floor of 4%, and then we've set a cap of 99%. Essentially, it's uncapped. So that's how you could capture a floor within the crediting rate, and then that would also then flow into the risk assumptions and all of the ALM modeling. The middle expression you see there is one where you've applied a cap rather than a floor. So those are a couple of examples. We put those in because they're quite common cash balance and crediting rates, but if people have other more complex ones, then we can of course help people set those up. As we said earlier, the Python expression capabilities here are pretty flexible.
Perfect, thanks. So I'll probably take the next one for you. So a slight aside to the main topic of today's WebEx, but the strategies framework looks very flexible. Can it be used for other things? The answer to that is yes. Strategies is very flexible. You could use it for modeling alternative strategies within your current portfolio. So if you wanted to put in a glide path or a policy index or potentially an old glide path or even a 60-40 benchmark that a lot of clients want to compare themselves to see how they performed against those. Really, strategies can be used for however you think it would be beneficial. So you can adjust the liabilities and leave the assets the same, or you can leave the liabilities the same and adjust your assets however you want. We do have a training deck on that, so we can send that out to you as well, and it talks you through the steps that you would have to take to create those additional strategies. Another question is, can you provide more detail on the purpose of the historic rates expression within the setup? So that would be this section here, Michael.
Yes, so that's a common question because it's a little bit nuanced. Essentially, this expression is used to capture actual interest credits that have occurred between the cash flow valuation date and a subsequent month end or daily roll forward date that you want to analyze. So for example, if the latest cash flows you have available are 12/31/2018 cash flows, you could still be using those within the platform. The system would be rolling those forward. But of course, at this point during 2020, you would need to make sure that you're incorporating the known 2019 increase. So that's what this area is doing. So you can see the kind of the expression, it says get historic yields. It's then referencing the actual published treasury yields. And then the second parameter, that 9, is where you define the look back. So in this case, the plan has a look back to September, so it's using September published rates to be the actual crediting rate. So this is how you are capturing known increases. It's not that important typically if you've got cash flows coming in every year and you're doing an annual refresh, but to the extent that the cash flows are not coming in with that regularity, you can use that area to make sure that the roll forwards remain as current and accurate as possible.
Perfect. Next question. I have a client that uses a market-based interest crediting rate. Example would be the S&P 500. They are interested to capture the daily change in the S&P 500 with their liability valuation. Is this possible?
Well, I think it's possible, yes. So within the methodology expression, it's an example where the power of this expression-based formulas really comes through again. You can set up a two-part assumption that essentially allows you to capture the current year change in the S&P 500. So you could define the change since the end of 2019. So on a daily basis, the 2020 calendar year change in S&P 500 could be coming through in that first tenor of your assumption. And then the second part of the assumption could then follow a long-term rate of 6% or whatever the actuary uses. So if you set the assumption up like that, then your liabilities on a daily basis would track the current year's change in S&P returns. So you would kind of see that volatility in line with what you would expect on the asset side of things. It's a good question.
Perfect. And I got one more question for you if you can handle it. I work with a client that has a pension equity plan. I know these have similarities to cash balance plans, but can they be modeled in Faro?
Yes, so it's a good question. I know that pension equity plans are a lot less common than cash balance plans, but they clearly have similarities. The normal form of payment is a lump sum, like a cash balance plan. I know that there's two types of the pension equity plans. There's some that have explicit crediting rates, which very much look like cash balance plans. There's others that have implicit interest crediting rates, but it's something I have looked at in the past, and regardless of which type of plan it is, which way the interest crediting rate is configured, both can be modeled accurately within Faro. The crediting rate that you see here that's used for cash balance plans can be equally used for pension equity plans, and the functionality would work just as well.
Perfect. So we are right at 1:30 almost, so I think we should stop here. So Michael and I would like to thank you for attending. Hopefully you found this useful. This is recorded, so if anyone needs a copy of this, I know that a couple of people said that they didn't have audio, so please reach out and I will send you a copy of this. And then enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you, everybody.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.